Hello and welcome to the Path to Wellbeing. I'm a crisis supporter and wellbeing coordinator here at Lifeline WA. Grief is something we all experience at some point in our lives, whether it's a bereavement, the loss of a pet, a broken relationship, a failed pregnancy, even having family overseas. And yet we often struggle to know how to support someone when they are grieving. What's the right thing to say? What's the wrong thing to say? So in this interview, I talked to Hayley, who came to us from the Grief Centre WA. Hayley has a wealth of knowledge and experience in the area of grief and loss. So together we talk about what grief is and I guess unpack a little what some of those deep-rooted fears and emotions are around grief. So yeah, it was a very interesting chat and I really hope you enjoy it. So welcome to Hayley, joining us from the Grief Centre WA. Thank you for coming in today, Hayley. I just wonder if you could tell us a little bit about what the Grief Centre is and what you do.
Okay, so at the Grief Centre, it is the key resource and support centre for grief in Western Australia, and we provide support services, education, events for people who've experienced any kind of loss. We predominantly focus on bereavement because that's a serious loss, but other losses like loss of relationship, loss of pet, loss of job, moving to another country can be a significant loss for people, their loss of their culture or their country. So those kinds of losses we also will provide support for. And so we run support groups, we do counselling, we do educational workshops and creative therapeutical workshops, and we run community events, memorials and other kinds of events to gather people to talk about grief and educate and make grief a normal part of life because it is part of everyday living.
It is so important to talk about, isn't it?
Yes.
But it is very difficult to talk about, or it can be.
Yes, it can be difficult for some people because it brings up emotion for them, and our community doesn't like to feel any kind of emotion.
We were just talking about that, weren't we? The fact that we might both end up in tears at some point in this interview and how that is quite uncomfortable, but it's important for people to recognise that that's okay.
Yeah, definitely. And uncomfortable emotion is what makes us do things we don't really want to do, but we want to run away from those uncomfortable emotions. So you find people who are experiencing grief but don't really want to address their grief might take up things like gambling, shopping more than they normally would, watching more TV than they should, drinking more than they would, of any kind of avoidant behaviour because they don't want to feel those negative emotions that are associated with grief. But it's okay. And that's, I think, the key message today is grief is normal. It's a part of life. And it's okay to be sad. It's okay to be angry. It's okay to feel guilt. It's okay to feel joy and relief. There's a whole gamut of emotions that we can feel. And so today I give you permission, Victoria, if you need to cry, feel free because it's okay.
Yeah, it's not comfortable to do it publicly and with a camera pointing in your face, but that is definitely a very important message that we want to get across, isn't it?
Definitely, definitely.
And you're based in somewhere near here in Subiaco, or?
We're in Chewett Hill.
Chewett Hill.
Yes, at Chewett College.
Okay.
Is our primary location. We also do some counselling out of Willagee. We've got some rooms down there. Okay. But we also get out into the community. We work a lot with the local councils. We're going to be at Subiaco Library coming up in July for a series of positive ageing workshops. So we try to get out as much as we can to meet up with people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we'll probably touch on this at the end, but if someone listens to this and just thinks, yeah, I know someone or I'm struggling with grief, I really want to reach out, how's the best way to get in touch with you?
Okay, so best way is to either phone us, and our phone number is on our website, which is griefcenterwa.org.au.
Title behind you there.
Yes, yeah. So if they just go to our website, they can contact us via filling in the contact us form on the site or phoning us, and the number's on the site.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. So we've both talked about our own personal journeys with grief. I wonder if you're willing to share some of your stories or
Sure.
what got you to this place now where you're talking about and learning about grief.
Yeah, so as a 23-year-old, I experienced my first significant grief. I was studying and we got a phone call in May to say that my father's mother had passed away, so my nana. And then a short week later, we got another phone call to say that my mother's mother had passed away. So I had two very close griefs of two people that were very significant in my life. Fast forward to August, I saw someone hit on a freeway, and so I was first responder, and so this notion of death and life was very much in my face. In September, I rolled my car on the freeway and was fortunate to not be seriously injured. But again, this message of accidents happen was in my face. And then in December, my mother was killed in a car accident head on. So I had this really significantly painful, traumatic year of loss. Fortunately, 5 months prior to the first loss, I'd coincidentally, I've probably divinely organised. There'd been a nun that came to the college and taught about grief, and she'd shared Kubler-Ross's model of grief and talked about grief. And one of the things she said was she'd had a friend who's had died of cancer, and she had an 18-year-old and a 14-year-old, and the 18-year-old had been so strong through everything, organised the funeral and looked after the 14-year-old, and everyone was sort of amazed at her strength. But 12 months later had taken her life, and the nun was so kicking herself that she hadn't spent more time and really helped her to
she thought
address
she was okay.
the grief. She thought she was okay. But she wasn't. And so her message to us was, if you're in grief, every way to express it is on the table for you other than self-harm or harming others. So if you need to scream, scream. If you need to cry, cry. If you need to write copious amounts of poetry, write it. Whatever you need to do to get the grief outside of your body, do. And so when it came to me and I was in that deep grief because I'd lost my home, I'd lost my financial support, my main person in my world when my mum was taken. So my whole life got turned upside down. So I just remembered those words, and I would scream into my pillow. I wrote volumes of poetry about the process. I cried. I had good friends that surrounded my life. So I was really very blessed at that time to have the comfort of friends. But I every day cried on the train going to work because we used to ride the train together. So it was a very significant loss in my life. So
it was.
So I have that, and I've carried that forward. There have been other losses. I lost my mother-in-law to brain cancer, which was a pretty difficult journey. And I've had friends that have lost children. I've lost a friend to suicide. And so all of these experiences, I think, gave me an understanding of what it feels like to walk through those difficult spaces. About 3 years ago, I was approached by Christine Overstone, who's the founder of the Grief Centre, to help write some curriculum because I have an education training background around this grief literacy. And then she asked, would I come onto the committee, the management committee? So I did 12 months in the chair role. And then I sort of stepped away. I was too busy with other things. But then I had another significant grief, which we were talking about a little bit earlier, which was a loss of job. I was retrenched from my day job, and it just took the legs out from under me. And so I found myself back at the Grief Centre. They had a 6-week fill-in role, and I said, okay, yeah, I'll do it because I'm not working now. And so then that's landed me here. So I'm now working full-time for the centre and loving this work. And the big learning for me has been how to sit comfortably with uncomfortable emotions, as we were talking earlier about. When I learned that it's okay, I don't have to fix another human being. I can actually allow them to feel. That was just a massive game changer for me.
Was that a sort of aha moment for you? Can you remember a point where you recognised that?
Absolutely, I can remember that because I had trauma in my childhood. I think I'd spent my whole life trying to fix every situation and control it so there was not a negative outcome for anybody. And so coming into this space where people, we'll have a support group and you might have someone come in and wail because they're in deep, raw grief. And normally, for me, that would have been
uncomfortable.
A very uncomfortable feeling.
Not to mention potentially triggering for you to see someone else's profound grief in front of you.
Yes, and I have always cried with those that cry. That's just me. I'm very empathetic, so I cry at MASH moments. That's what my husband calls it.
MASH moments.
I cried watching MASH one day, and so we call them MASH moments at home. So I am empathetic, but yeah, to be able to see somebody distressed and not feel like I have to be the solution to their distress, definitely I can come and be a balm on that. And I would say, listening to people on the phone, the first thing that comes in my heart is, how can I ease their distress, in the sense of allowing them to know what they're going through is okay, that it's normal. I've had older gentlemen, for example, ring up and go, my partner of 60 years has died, and I find myself weepy and feeling like that's not okay because they're a bloke.
Exactly.
And for me to say, actually, I'd really expect that 2 years after that death, you'd still be feeling that. They go, you can almost audibly hear the sigh of relief.
Yeah.
I'm okay. I'm normal. And then when you say, and we have a group of other people that have been through similar things that meet once a week, and they have a bit of social time as well as doing the group support. You hear them go, there's somewhere I can be that knows what I'm going through, that will accept how I feel and give me some validation.
Not try to fix it,
and not try
judge,
to fix it, and not
feel
judge.
uncomfortable. All those things that you can sometimes get when you talk about it with friends, well-meaning family members, who are uncomfortable with it, want to fix it, want to help, want it to go away.
Yeah, and I think if you were to challenge those people that are in that situation, it is about them more so than it's about the person that's actually in distress. It's about them feeling better and them not having to experience the distress of the other person. And that's because we all think about ourselves first.
We do.
Let's just acknowledge that. We all think self first. And so, no judgment on that, but just to acknowledge that's the reality is we don't want to feel uncomfortable. And if you look at human beings and the way we're made up to be safe. And safety looks like a comfort zone. And when we're in the comfort zone, we're very happy. And whenever we're pushed out of the comfort zone, we fight to get back into the comfort zone in whatever way that is. So we want to feel safe. That's our normal mechanism. But sometimes the healing process sits in that outside of the comfort zone space. And so it's about supporting people to stretch themselves to feel so they can heal. And healing doesn't always look like, I think sometimes we think, okay, tick that one off, I'm healed now.
Yeah.
Move on. Healing doesn't necessarily look like that. It can look like this.
Yeah.
It can be a lifetime journey.
I was going to say, would you then say that grief is always with you?
Definitely.
And different griefs that you've accumulated along the way, they're always there. They never go away. You're never better.
I think better. What is better?
No, exactly. I'm using it for a reason.
But it's like the word process. Who has processed their grief?
There's not an end point where tick, that's done.
Yes, I don't think that because if it was Hayley Solich at 57, who lost her mum at 23, would not still be triggered sometimes. When I have a thought of my mother or when there's a situation where I would have loved for her to be there, I would not have that sadness still. And I think that if we think about it in terms of bonds, you have a bond with the person, the pet, the situation, the job. And so that bond doesn't just go away. A person dies, the bond to that person doesn't die when they die. So you can have that bond for the whole of your life. And so it's normal, people, my sister, for example, and I don't think she'd mind me sharing this. When my mother died, she was in the car accident with my mother and it affected her probably quite a bit more deeply than it did myself.
I guess that's the whole other topic, isn't it? The combination of trauma.
Yes.
With
Yes.
grief.
So what she did was she created a space in her house that had all the treasures from my mother. And you know, to use her words, that was her shrine. And so for her, it was probably 25 years, maybe 30 years before she felt comfortable to let go of some of those things because they were a connection to the experience as well. So it was a healing process for her. And then she got to a point where she felt like, I actually don't need to have this like this, but I can still have things that connect me to our mother within my room. And we can talk about that. And we always talk about my mum when I go to see her. So, you know, she hasn't gone.
No.
She's still with us. She's still with us. And my sister often talks about, for her, she sees signs of her in the clouds or other things that send messages to her that make her feel comfort. So I think that's the other part of the long-term journey with grief, is that people will use all kinds of things for their comfort. And so we need to be accepting, I think, of how people want to grieve. It is individual. The timing and the term of the grief is individual. The way in which we want to memorialise is individual. One person might plant a plant, another one might light a candle, another one might go and sit on a mountaintop. You know, how we express our grief and how we how we do memorialising of the person and the relationship is going to be individual. And so as a community, if we want to be truly inclusive, I think we have to just open ourselves to think some people might do it differently. They might want to talk to the person. They might want to say they've received messages from the person. That might be their way of doing their grieving process. And what we don't want to do is pathologise grief, which is what sort of happens is people get sad and then people are interpreted as being depressed. And then they get into mental health services, they get medicated. What it is it's just grief that needs to be addressed.
A natural human experience.
Yeah.
That we don't necessarily need medication for, but need to normalise the process and be able to talk about the person, the loss, the feelings, and it'd be okay to, as you say, express the emotions.
Yeah, and I think, you know, if you separate out grief and trauma, because they are two separate things, they can happen to the same person through the same event. The trauma does sometimes need support through some kind of psychological process, but the grief part of it needs healing. I think even with trauma, I think there's 3 T's of dealing with complex trauma, and that is time, tears, and talking.
So I think I've heard that.
Tears are definitely a part of this healing process that we have, and you don't get to tears if you don't feel.
No.
So
there's something definitely physiological about tears.
Yes.
About the crying.
Yeah.
And something, some sort of release, isn't there? Some sort of emotional release.
Well, it's actually scientifically proven that it's a release of toxins from your body when you cry. So the stress, probably the stress hormones that you're feeling get released out through the tear ducts.
Yeah.
So it's healthy to cry.
It is. Yeah.
Yeah.
So going back to what you said about that initial loss and the feelings that you experience when you're feeling that intense grief at the very beginning, and the fact that it's up and down, it's not linear, it's not a process that you get to the end and it's over. I'm just sort of wondering about the feelings that you have at the very beginning, and, you know, from experience myself with the loss of my dad and my mum, with the loss of her husband, that fear that you potentially have at the beginning, and I know my mum has, that how long is this going to last? How bad is it going to get? I'm right at the beginning. Not knowing what that's going to be like, what that journey is going to look like, can be quite fearful.
Yes. Yeah.
And how do you manage that? How do you get through that?
Yeah. So I always say when somebody has a loss, you've got that shock period. I remember the police coming to our door, and I know that for me, I was probably in the shock of the news for probably a week at least, trying to work out,
absolute disbelief.
How does this slot in? How does it work? What does life look like? Your brain goes into, when you're in shock, your brain goes into overwhelm and stress on your body. You know, your body is designed amazingly to look after your internal organs. So when people are in that intense grief, your body's going to be wanting to protect your functionality. So your emotion, your ability to manage your emotions doesn't get as much energy. So that's why you get people who are slamming doors or going into seclusion at these times, because they don't have the energy to manage the interrelationships with other people or to control their emotions as much. So it is a really stressed out time for your body, functionally speaking. So overwhelming the brain. Choice making requires energy. You don't have as much energy to put towards that. So it's not a good time to have to make choices. It's number one.
And yet it's often a time when you do have to plan a funeral and make big decisions.
Big decisions. And I say people lose their brains when it comes to those things, because having been through, sitting around the table with family members, having to work out the money and the estate and stuff, it was horrendous, awful. I'd never want to experience that again, because people were not being rational and thinking like they normally would in our loving relationships. No. Their brain has left the building.
And when you've got a whole group of people who have all been impacted by the same loss but are experiencing it differently, and trying to come together and support each other whilst looking after their own well-being, it's very difficult.
It is a challenge. And so my advice to people in that situation is to, if you're feeling heightened emotion, is step back and breathe and don't engage until you feel like you actually have a bit better control of yourself, because it can be a very damaging time for family relationships. My eldest brother and I had a very difficult relationship at that point. We didn't talk for 30 years. It just was the way it worked out.
After the death of
my mother. And
so it was kind of a catalyst for that relationship breakdown.
Definitely was a catalyst for the relationship breakdown. Fortunately, we've managed to get beyond that now, but it took
that's an indication
long
of
time.
Quite how powerful that time is, isn't it?
Yes.
That it can have that impact on a relationship.
Definitely it can. And I mean, I moved over here from Sydney, so that was, I put distance between us was one thing, but it just, it was very, very damaging for us as a family. And we noticed that year, our family, I'm from a very large family. We had 9 immediate aunts and uncles on one side and same on the other. So we're a very big family. But I noticed the whole family spilled out into Australia. We were all clustered together, but it just went very fractured as a family. And so there was multiple losses, I think, with the deaths of the three major matriarchs in my line. And so I think it's really important people surrounding people who are grieving understand they're not going to be themselves. You can't timeline it.
No. You can't say, right, well, it's been a year now, so that's it.
That's it. Pull your socks up.
Should be at least a bit better off. Now. Won't be expecting any of that behaviour, because it's not like that, is it?
No, and also, I've got a friend who's a widow, and immediately when the person passed, they had a period of sadness, and then they dusted themselves off and got moving. Came first year anniversary, they were back to where they were 12 months before, because the reality hit again. And I think that's the other part is, you have a loss and then you go, I want to cope with life. So you put it to the back of your mind.
You want to put the lid on those emotions for a bit so you can
be functional and get on with life. But then something comes and says, hang on, I'm still here. You still have to deal. And I think that's when it can come back up. So we really have to be gracious with one another and accepting, okay, so today's a bad day.
And that's a nice way of putting it, being gracious with each other, that sort of acceptance and support.
Yeah, and what that could look like is that when someone has passed and, everyone is mobbing the person with love and grace and comfort, but often they come going, what can I do for you? And the other person who's had the loss, thinking about those things I just said, they're in overwhelm, can't make those decisions. So sometimes it's helpful to come and say, I will.
Just do it.
I will pick up the mail for you, or I will get some groceries for you. Is there anything that you want that, specifically? So it's less about putting a whole load of what can I do for you, which could be any number of things. It might even be, or I can do this, this and this, and then allowing them some choice, because the other thing is you don't want to take over another person's life. That's disempowering. So it is about being respectful of what the person needs, but also being aware that they may not know what they need or be able to tell you what they need in that moment.
But that language being important, not just giving them a load of questions.
Yes.
Gently, if you know the person well enough, you'll know that, okay, they've got children that need picking up, or maybe it would be helpful to cook something, or and being there for them.
Yeah, and I think it is around intimacy too, because it's the last thing you need is a stranger coming into your space when you are not coping yourself. You don't want judgment on you. So it is being a bit sensitive to the individual's needs, and that might be they might need seclusion. They might need to be on their own for a period of time to wail and do those things. I always laugh when I think about my mother-in-law dying, not because she died, but what it created was we had to do the clean out of the house, and there were odds and sods left over from the cups and saucers. So there were things that didn't marry up with anything. They're not kind of things you would take down to Good Sammy's, because they'd just be, extra burden rather than helpful.
Yeah.
And I didn't know what to do with them. And I was standing outside the house, I had this box of them, and I just went, you know what, I'm actually going to offload these one at a time into the bin. I'm going to smash them, and I'm going to use that opportunity to let go of all of the angst, because we'd had some terrible sort of things happen in that relationship towards the end. And I just went, I'm just going to use it as an exercise.
Yeah, smash those cups.
Smash those cups and plates. So I felt for the neighbours, because it was probably a bit noisy, but cathartic.
It helped, did it?
It really helped, and it got rid of the problem, but it also gave me an opportunity just to get some of the grief out of my body through that action. So I wouldn't, recommend everyone go around smashing things all the time, but certainly that was something that benefited me in that moment.
But interesting that sort of, that physical thing. So
yes.
Having some exercise in terms of self-care when you're experiencing those feelings.
Yes.
Going for a run, doing some contact sport, whatever it is, something that's going to just enable you to, in a safe space, let some of that energy out. Yeah,
definitely. And I've screamed into my pillow at different times. I've punched the pillow if I needed to, because it's not fair. Let's just call it. It is not fair. If you've got a child that dies, it is not fair.
It's not.
Parents should never outlive their kids. It's not fair. If you've had to nurse someone through to the end, and you've spent 18 months keeping them alive, and then you have to watch them die, it's not fair. And especially if they died in not so nice circumstances, and some of the ends can be really traumatic, it's not fair. It just is what it is. And there can be a sense of rage and despair that sits around that. And we do need to find a healthy way to let some of that out. So, a pillow is not going to hurt somebody.
No.
But it could hurt you holding it inside yourself.
Definitely. Yeah, I'm sure you've seen some of that in your time.
Yeah, in different ways. And the other thing was just a story. Our expectations around others around death can be very unfair as well. My partner, when we knew my mother-in-law was dying, I said from the get-go, I'm not going. I don't want to see her dead. I want to remember her alive. That's what I wanted as a memory. So the phone call comes. Everyone goes up to the hospital except for me, from the siblings and their wives. And my partner was so angry with me because he felt unsupported. But even though I'd in advance let him know I don't want to be there, that's not the memory I wanted.
That's my choice.
That was my choice that I wanted to make. So I think it's really important to get that message out as well. Our expectations of others around how they're going to handle death and dying can be unfair. But if he had communicated to me, I need you to be there. For me as a gift of love to me, I would have been there.
Okay.
I would have sacrificed to be there, but he didn't.
But you felt he wasn't understanding your need to not be there.
No, he definitely didn't understand my need, and it caused us a lot of grief.
So going back to what you were saying a little bit earlier about it not being linear, about there being stages, and you became aware. Was it when the nun came in to speak to you when you were young and came in to speak about stages of grief?
Yes, that was so helpful. So from a centre perspective, from the grief centre, Kubler-Ross, if you look at it and go, I have to do 1 through to 5.
So what are they? Let's just name them.
So I think it's anger, denial, bargaining, acceptance, exploration of the new what's possible. Yeah, I think that's that next stage.
Because I've heard that there's 5 core, and then there's potentially 7.
Yes. Yeah.
So
that's,
but basically the idea that there are stages, and there's this sort of belief that, so first of all, it's going to be shock, and then it's going to be depression, and then it's going to be whatever they are, and that's not the case. You can hop in and out of them.
Yeah.
They're there, and it's good to be aware that this is a normal stage of grief, but it doesn't mean to say that because you've passed one stage, you're not going to experience that again.
Yeah, that's right. And I think from Kubler-Ross' perspective, this was just broad categorising of behaviour was the intention. If you want to look at a model that's helpful, Warden's model is a really helpful model because that talks about the tasks of mourning.
Okay.
And it's basically takes you through, and I haven't got it written down, but I'll just say, go and look up Warden's task of mourning.
Task of mourning.
Which sort of talks about how we journey through grief and we explore our own emotions, and then we explore the relationship with the person that's passed, and then we come to a point where we decide how we're going to move forward with that relationship. So it allows space for those enduring bonds with the person that's passed, which I think is really helpful. So definitely I would suggest Warden's book. There's a whole book about it, but that model, and you can find it online very easily, is helpful in looking at, if you're looking at a model of grieving. But I guess my key message is that grief is unique. How you do it and how I do it will be different. We had an open day. I got a tree. I got people to write how their family grieves, and I'll give you an example of how different it can be. If I use my own family, we've got English and English-Irish backgrounds. So my mother's family grieve quietly, very respectfully. They have a very solemn grief. My father's family, the Irish family, they celebrate grief, and they party and they joke, and they have it's a fun time. It's a gathering of family. So
are you talking about sort of in the initial stages as part of the...
It's part of the like funerals,
yes.
As part of the funeral.
So it's more of a celebration.
It's more of a celebration. So I'll give you an example. We go to my Nana's funeral, my father's mother's funeral. My mum, a few years previous, had nursed one of my aunts who died of leukemia. That was my father's sister. So she decides when we go to the funeral, she's going to go to the cemetery and pay her respects to my aunt and to my nana, and the rest of the family go off to my uncle's house. So at my uncle's house, they're drinking, they're partying, they're telling stories about Nana and celebrating her life. My mother's been sitting out at the cemetery in a very solemn place. She comes to the house and sees everyone partying and is offended. And so we have a clash, and when we have to leave, and it's a big deal and hoo-ha. And so that's just to sort of give you a snapshot. In one family, you've got two very different cultures of how they process their grief and work with grief. So imagine in a multicultural community, it's done differently for everybody. If you go to our Aboriginal community, they'll have their sorry time, their days of sadness. They'll gather the whole family. Everyone's expected to come. That's respect. It's a family member that's passed, and that's how they show their respect. So they'll have expectations around a grief, and you're expected to leave work whether you got leave or not. You come and you gather, and so some of our societal expectations make it difficult.
Yeah, it can be difficult,
that community to honour in that way. I was at a multicultural event. We were talking about this recently, and some communities pay wailers to come, professional mourners to come to the funeral to kick off the grief.
To wail,
to literally wail and cry loudly at the funeral. So that was Eastern European culture, and also some of the Asian cultures would have that
because there's no doubt
commonality.
That hearing or seeing someone cry, you talked about that earlier on, about how you're very empathetic, and if you see someone crying, you'll cry.
Yes.
And that is a sign, and the person feels that you really understand their grief.
Yes.
So, having those wailers coming in kind of gives everyone permission as well.
It does. And you don't know what you're going to feel as well. I had a friend lost her 18-year-old son. I'd known him for many, many years. We didn't have a really close relationship. I was going to the funeral and I thought, I'm going for my friend more than for myself. And I walked in and then I saw his face up on the big screen. I was a mess. Unexpected, deep grief, raw grief hit me. And so I didn't expect that. And I think that any expectation we have around grief is bound to be disappointing to you as an individual. I think it is a space that's so unique and dependent on 100,000 things, because you might not think you're going to grieve, but it might be a sound you hear. It might trigger a memory of your own grief in another space and another time. So this is why I'm saying we need to normalise grief. We need to accept it's part of life. From the day you're born to the day you die, you're going to experience loss. You'll lose your pets, you'll lose your toys, you'll lose your property, you'll lose your friends, they'll move towns, you'll lose your relationships, you'll lose your loved ones, you'll lose your friends. I lost a friend to suicide, never expected that to happen. You can't control any of it.
No.
And so giving yourself permission to feel and to experience emotion and to accept and address loss is really significantly important.
Which is a really important message that we want to share, and we want everyone to sort of embrace that. But the fact is there are still a lot of people who aren't going to be comfortable with it. And if you're walking through the supermarket and you see something that reminds you of a loss and you uncontrollably, the tears come, there are going to be people around you who aren't going to be comfortable and aren't going to be able to support you. And that's the reality.
Yes.
But I guess what you're promoting and providing in the Grief Centre is that very safe space where people can know that they are coming to see you, and if they had to held on to it while they were at the shops or with a certain person, they can then take the lid off when they come to you and can let it out. So
absolutely.
And there's a real comfort in that.
So one of the questions I think you sent me was, unpack your vision. What's your vision? Well, my vision is a world where you can go to the shopping centre and be triggered and have a grief response, and everyone around you doesn't react; they respond with compassion. That's the world
difference in
we
language,
want to
isn't
see.
It? Respond rather than react.
Yeah, and that's why we're doing our Grief is a Part of Life, and new conversation workshops out in the community, because we want to open these conversations. We want people to know that grief is not a medical condition. It's actually part of normal human experience, and that we can be there for one another if we become aware of ourselves, aware of others, learn to respond rather than react to the emotions in others. Then our community benefits on so many levels.
Because I think, as you said, a reaction would come from a place of fear and I don't want to say the wrong thing, I don't want to look foolish, all those thoughts that you have. So the safest thing is to walk away or to change the subject and avoid it.
Yeah.
And if we can make it less uncomfortable for people to talk about, then that's going to support everyone, because we are all going to experience grief. That's one thing that is guaranteed. Like our own death is guaranteed. We are going to lose something at some point. Yeah,
absolutely. And so it surprises me what grief looks like. One of my daughters, when she was 7, came to me with a photo frame of my mother, and she goes, "I wish I'd known Grandma." And she's sobbing her heart out. But that's loss, because she recognised the loss of the potential relationship she had with the grandmother. So sometimes it can be, if I think of one of my workmates who is infertile, never had the chance to have a child, that's a deep loss for her. She feels that loss in community every time she's surrounded by children. People are asking, have you got children? Everyone's talking about what their children are doing, So our losses don't necessarily have to be something we've experienced. It might be something we haven't experienced.
Yes, that is very interesting.
And so I guess that's why I'm saying grief is so much a part of our life. We need to normalise it. And
we need to know when it's there, because
yes,
you wouldn't always think that's a grief.
Yes.
But it's something you're expecting of your life. You're a woman, you think you're going to have children, and then realising that you can't.
Yes.
There's a loss of your identity there, a loss of who you thought you were going to be.
Yeah, definitely. And I think about it, there's a phrase called ambiguous loss. And when I was in mental health services working, I'm sitting in a a carer support group. The lady next to me starts speaking about her husband's had a brain injury. And she starts talking about the fact he can't pay for bills or do any of the things he used to do around the house. I start crying because suddenly I've realised I've got a partner who's incapacitated through mental health at that time, and he can't do some of those things he used to do for me. And so then I'm experiencing my grief, because ambiguous loss is about grief that's not like a death. It's a change that has caused a loss in our life. And so for me, it was the loss of functionality in my partner, and for her, it was a loss of functionality in her partner. And so you might become aware of a grief that you've been experiencing. Like for me, I had this sadness, but I didn't understand it. When I heard her story, I understood it. And so sometimes it can, you can be gain your understanding, I guess, along the pathway as you experience things with other people as well.
Yeah, and understanding it helps you to accept it, and normalise it, and ultimately deal with it, live with it, because that's what you have to do. You have to live with it rather than fighting it, or the sort of coping behaviours that you talked about early on that you might adopt if you've got these emotions, you don't understand them, you just want to squash them so you can get on with life. Yes. So you drink or you gamble or behave aggressively, whatever it is. We can minimise those if we understand it.
Yeah, that's right. And when you understand that what's happening for you in the relationship with the other person, their behaviours or their functionality issues or whatever it might be, you also are then able to go, I actually have to challenge myself. Do I have the right to be angry about that now? Because they're actually just behaving in the same way as this other person that's got the same challenge that they've got. And I was holding it against them. Do you know what I mean? Like in the relationship, you can hold on to, I guess, anger. If you're disappointed about something that's happened with another person, you can hold on to your emotions, your anger, feel agitated by their lack of contribution now. But when you recognise that actually it's not just them, it's somebody, any person in that situation with that limitation would be behaving in that way, suddenly you go, actually, I really don't have a right to be angry with them. I actually have to just accept that that's how they are now.
Yeah.
And so there is a letting go, I think, of some of the agitation out of the relationship. When you become aware and you start to understand, you can then let go and find the grace to be with the person as they are and accept the situation. Does that make sense?
Because as you said, grief looks different and everyone expresses it differently.
Yeah, it does.
And because it's not how you would be managing it doesn't mean to say that it's not still grief.
Yes, yeah, that's right. And in relationships, when we come, I guess in any relationship, when you come with a baggage of expectation, you're always going to be disappointed. But when you can release that baggage of expectation out of the relationship, and then anything that comes is really a bonus in the relationship. And so I think that understanding that ambiguous loss for me helped me to understand that I could let go of my expectation that he would be the same as he had been. I could accept that there'd been a change and accept that I had lost something and he'd lost something. It was acknowledging his loss. His loss is greater than my loss. I'm functional still. And so when I started to see that the other person had a significant loss and see it through the lens of their life, it gave me much deeper compassion.
And probably brings
empathy.
you closer.
It did, definitely.
Because you're not thinking what's going on. There's not that kind of misunderstanding between you.
Yeah, the angst.
I think when you talk about ambiguous loss, I'm thinking of the fact that I've lived here in Australia for 17 years, but it probably took me 10 years to realise that it was grief that I was experiencing every time I visited England and came back. I would go through like a process of a week or two, and I think it was always in combination with the jet lag, where I would feel grief every time I left my family.
Yes.
And that's just something that I think a lot of people around me didn't understand. And I think, me understanding it and being able to explain to them, I need a week. Sorry, I'm getting emotional now.
You're allowed. This is a space where you can just have that, feel it, release it. Yeah. It's tough leaving family and knowing this so far away. My family have lived on the other side of Australia, so I've been very much alone, so I understand that feeling.
Yeah, we do think of grief as death, and that, I think I used to think, but I'm not, why is my mum so upset? I'm not dead. I'm still here. I can speak to her on the phone. And I didn't understand her grief either, although I did. But it was this just kind of, not fully understanding that it was actually grief that she was feeling. I knew she missed me, but it was, Yeah. It's complex.
It is complex. And as a parent, just sharing earlier before about my daughter and needing her space, and her way was to just give us radio silence for a period of time, and the deep feeling of loss. The pain I felt, so much pain during it was a very short couple of months, really. Nothing significant compared to what some people go through with their families. But I felt such deep pain. And I think if our community can understand people feel, and that when you see and hear someone behaving in a way that you feel is unacceptable, not the norm, if you can ask the question, what's happening for them first before reacting, that would make a huge change in our community.
That's a really important question, isn't it? Because, I think having people who just kind of give you that space to talk about how you're feeling is really important.
Yes. Yeah.
Because sometimes you don't know until someone asks you that open question, and then you start to talk, and then you recognise what's going on as you talk about it. And that's what we do at Lifeline on the phone. That's the sort of open questions that we ask people that enable them to talk about their feelings and get the emotions out.
Yeah, it is that question of like, and I say this, if you're going to ask it, you have to be prepared to listen, because don't ask somebody what's going on for you if you haven't got time and you don't want to listen.
No,
because that's just it's futile and frustrating for the person. But if you will take the time to actually ask a person who's acting out, whatever way that might be, what's going on for you, you might be surprised what you hear. Sometimes it's something simple that can be solved through a community. Sometimes it can be deeper and obviously may need more support. But there's always something that we could do to be supportive if we are willing to be compassionate. And that's what I think the whole compassionate communities movement is about educating people so that they respond rather than react to people when they're in situations of crisis and pain, whatever that crisis and pain might look like. And I mean, Lifeline obviously does a wonderful job, because otherwise we wouldn't be telling everyone, ring Lifeline.
No, exactly. We hear it a lot on the television and the radio. So it's definitely helping people.
Yeah. So I was going to say something else. I'm just trying to remember. Just the importance, I guess, in if you're talking about suicide, just coming back to that as a topic. I went through suicidal ideation when I had postnatal depression, following the birth of my fourth child. And I think that it was related to grief because I'd lost a child between my last two and kind of just dusted myself off and moved forward. And didn't really give myself an opportunity to do a proper grief process with that loss. I just had to get on and make another baby to prove I could do that.
Something that you were encouraged to do at the time? Was the support available to you after the loss of a baby?
No, not really. I think, I got referred to a GP who has been wonderful. She's still my GP today. So over 20 years of service. So good on you, Kate. But not really to any kind of support service at the time. And we were in an impoverished lifestyle pretty much. I ended up with 4 children under 5 years of age. My partner was an apprentice at the time, and so it was difficult times for us. But when I had postnatal depression, I really struggled with the thoughts of suicide. In fact, my husband interrupted an attempt at suicide for me. And so they were really difficult days. For me, healing came through helping others. I got a job and I had to do with the job network and had to motivate people to get jobs. And my healing came very quick because I felt like I was making a difference and I had connection and a whole lot of things through that role. But it's very important, our language around suicide and the way we think about people ending their lives needs to shift as a community. The words committed suicide are very judgmental.
Well, that's something we don't say here.
Yeah,
so part of the training is we don't say committed because that implies a crime, that's something that's wrong, that's judgment. Yeah,
so just for the community, so people know, we use the language of died by suicide. And I think that having had a friend who took their life, I was the last person they spoke to. I had done all the right things. I'd done my mental health first aid. I'd followed the process. They'd been to counselling as per what I'd suggested to them, but they just got to a point where they decided that was how they were going to end their life. And it was terrible for me to know that I was the last person.
Absolutely.
It made me wonder what more could I have done. I don't know that there was more I could have done. And I think that when we talking to family survivors, people who have lived through that experience, it's the message that you can't know ahead of time what another person's going to do, and you can't know what brought them to that place and what made them make that choice, and it's unhelpful to blame yourself and it's unhelpful to blame them for making that choice. It just is what it is. That's what I had to come down to, is
that acceptance.
An acceptance that is what they chose. That was their decision. Everyone's got the right to make decisions about their own lives, and so I had to resolve that I had done everything in my power to be a good friend, but that was a choice that they made. And so I just wanted to sort of share that story for people. I think it's also important, the message. I did some work with young people back when I was doing youth work, and they used to write things like 16-year-olds writing, "I'd rather die high," etc. But I want to put the message out that life is extraordinary, so diverse. You can't possibly have known and seen all that could be seen and known about life, and to end life without having seen and tasted all of the richness and opportunities that there are in the world would be sad. And so my encouragement is to explore widely, in life. Don't, before you take your life, explore. There may be things you haven't tasted yet that will create joy in your life. So that's sort of a message that I shared with those young people in particular that were thinking there's nothing to live for, but there is. There's so much opportunity. We don't know. We know very little, like a little scrape of butter on the bread, when there's a whole opportunity. There's a whole world of opportunities if we stretch ourselves out of the comfort zone and taste and see.
Yeah, that's true. And you talk about so much loss that you've experienced in your life, and that you found some comfort and some healing in helping others. And I think that's a very similar story to a lot of people at Lifeline.
Yes.
A lot of people have experienced their own loss, have been touched by suicide. And there definitely is, I relate to it, that feeling of helping others, using the skills that we've learned to listen, communicate effectively, support people. It distracts you from your own thoughts and your own sadness, but also there's some real comfort in helping others. And I think that's
definitely
a really important message. And that's what you do at the Grief Centre.
Yeah, and look, there's surprisingly...
So I'm keen to talk about some of the things that you do. So, if we would have people listening who are thinking, okay, I definitely want to check this out, or I want to recommend this to someone, what are some of the things that are on offer? You mentioned counselling.
Yes.
There's something that I've written here that I read on your website that I thought was important to unpack as well. Grief and death are honoured and responded to with deep care, respect and emotional intelligence, which we have touched on. A community where people can process their grief and experience healing. And it's about that language, and you talk about building the literacy around grief and death.
Yes.
So that's an important part of it.
Yeah, so at the centre we run support groups on a Wednesday and Thursday evenings. The support group on the Wednesday, it's just turn up. And so it's co-facilitated by counsellors, trained counsellors, but it's a very organic group. So people will contribute or not contribute depending on that, and it's an opportunity to share stories. Thursday nights is a closed group, so you have to register for that via Humanitix, and that's more of a facilitated group. It's still with counsellors, and it's a smaller group. We will be starting first week of June a youth service, so that's 16 to 21-year-olds. It's called GIT, which is Growing Through It, or GTI, I should say, Growing Through It. That's going to be face-to-face on the first Tuesday of the month, and then the other weeks of the month will be online. So we'll have an therapeutical activities-based face-to-face, and then we'll do talk therapy in the online weeks. So we're really excited about that, getting that going. We're going to have some funding through Mental Health Commission to do this Suicide and Grief project. And what that will look like is we will be funded to do counselling and support. So we'll run some grief and suicide postvention programs. So there'll be 6 to 8 week programs. So that's for any person that's been touched by suicide, whether that's suicidal thinking, attempted suicide, or loss of a family member or friend through suicide. They're the 3 categories that can participate in that. So that'll be building that self and other awareness, the emotional intelligence, and also the grief literacy around that, and providing that support as well. So it'll be some talk therapy and that story sharing. So that'll be starting probably in July. We're also going to be running a suicide and grief forum in July, which will be the launch of the project. And we're inviting community to come and to share stories at that particular event. We want to hear from the community what's important to them as we move forward with the project. And with the project, we'll be getting out into community to run workshops. So there'll be suicide prevention and grief workshops. So that'll be in Perth Metro, plus also out in the country regions over the next 12 months. And we also have events that we run every year. So we do a high tea in August, which is just community gathering. And we also do In Memory of Ordinary Things event in December, which is a lovely event where you can bring memorabilia from the person and have photos taken with that as a memorial for yourself. I had photos taken with my mother's wedding rings last year. It was special. My whole family came. We had family portrait done.
So it doesn't mean to say that this has to happen a certain amount of time after the loss, because this is a significant time period after.
Oh, yes. Yeah, no, anytime. Because that's the other part of, and this is an important message, Kath, our lead, gave me to write down. She said, make sure that you say, it doesn't matter what the relationship was, when it occurred, or the manner in which it occurred. That's really important in terms of the grief centre. So it can be any person that's been part of your life at any time.
Any person, anything?
Anything. Well, pet, for example, yes.
Or we talked
or
about
event, yes.
Loss of a pregnancy
Yes.
or loss of a relationship.
Yes.
If you don't have separate events for different grief?
No, because what we found with running the Wednesday group was grief is grief.
It is.
Grief is grief. It transcends events, if that makes sense.
Categories.
And categories. And we found you might have two people who are in say a suicide prevention grief group, for example. But one of those might have lost a child and one of them might have lost an adult. And so you might have over in your other group over here someone who's lost a child, and the situation might have been similar. And so there's a connection. It's a different connection. So what we found was it was better to bring the whole group together. And then you've got, I don't know, something organic about different ages, because that group goes across all of the ages. So you might have a 70-year-old who relates to something that a 16-year-old's
and
going
that will
to.
naturally evolve within that session.
Yes.
But you're not necessarily going to put this person next to that person and, compartmentalize it.
That's right. And so the other thing we run is the workshops, and the workshops are really helpful. I'll tell you a story. This particular person was in their 60s. They had come to the workshop. What they recognised through the workshop was that they shared story. They'd been affected by the death of a brother when they were 7 when they died. When that brother died, the mother donned black and wore black till she died at 97. So her whole growing up time, her mother wore black. She cleaned out the bedroom straight away, and they were not allowed to go into the room, and they were not allowed to say the name of the brother that had passed. That was her way of managing the grief. So that child grew up in a very colourless world.
And learning that that's how you
and that's how you do
manage grief.
And so what happened was she grew up with a lot of fear. Growing up. So when she was a parent, she wouldn't let her kids go here or there. They didn't do trips. They didn't buy bicycles in case someone died. There was a lot of fear that entered her world. And so at 60, what Chris often says in these things is that you might have grief that's out of date that needs to be revisited. And when they did that in that session, that woman was able to recognise that fear was no longer valid, that it was out of date. It didn't belong to her, it belonged to her mother. So she is now cycling around the world and she sent an email to Chris and she said, colour has re-entered my world, because it was a significant shift in her lifestyle and her thinking and her understanding. And so it is important, I guess, that we revisit our grief. What happened to me with my mum when I was 23 caused me to have fear of being in a car for many years after that. And I still, to this day, if I'm driving on an open road in the country, the thought comes to my mind, am I going to have an accident? That is part of...
never go away.
It probably will never go away. But I don't have to change my driving habits. Like, if I allowed that fear to have a hold on me, then I wouldn't go anywhere and I wouldn't do anything. No. I had to get to a point where I just went, okay, instead of death gripping the handles in the car, I had to go, actually, I'm just going to trust I'm going to be okay.
You're going to have the thought process will still be there, but the fear will perhaps soften.
Yes. Yeah. So revisiting past ways of behaving with grief, and some of it's been modelled. If your father, for example, my father was an alcoholic, if your father drinks to cope, then you might think that's what you need to do.
Without realising that you're actually thinking that. It's just subconscious.
Yeah, you just might do whatever's been modelled to you. So sometimes we have to sort of stop and consciously think about why we do what we do. there's so many losses in our community. If I think about Aboriginal community, I was just in a conversation recently around domestic violence even, and why Aboriginal women don't report domestic violence. And that goes back to the intergenerational trauma. They fear they'll lose their children. And so, the losses can be passed on
through generations.
Down through the generations. And this is why, to me, the message of grieving is so important. If you look, it underlies the ills of our community. Our prisons are full of people who haven't grieved, whose lives may be different.
And their coping behaviours are ending them in jail.
Well, my partner, and I know he won't mind me saying this, when his mother died, that was his coping strategy. That caused us tremendous grief as a family, but it was because he did not know how to deal with her loss. She was diagnosed on his birthday. She went out for lunch with him, got lost in the shopping centre where they were, couldn't find her way back, and then they found out she had brain tumour. So, for him, it's all connected together, his loss, and he couldn't separate it out. And so it caused us a lot of grief. And so I can see how, within some of the, the AOD community in particular, how that can be a big driver of some of the behaviours that we see, some of the alcoholism, etc., some of the drug taking. Sitting underneath that is a load of grief of losses, whether it be relationship breakdowns or family losses. People just can't cope. Haven't learnt to cry because they have to pull their socks up and get on.
She'll be all right.
Get on, soldier on,
you
know. We could learn a lot, I think, from some of the communities that encourage the display of emotions.
Yeah, I think that's an important message. And just to sort of finish off, maybe summarise some of the positive coping mechanisms that we can think about.
Yes.
I just wanted to talk about, I read on your website, Sing to Heal sessions and Walking with Grief project. They both sound uplifting and positive. What's that about?
Okay, so we were running last year. We were running some Sing to Heal. Basically, it just was communal singing. It was an opportunity to come out and to sing some songs, and we chose songs that had a bit of an uplift message. We know that when you sing in community, you get an endorphin rush. That's how our bodies are wired. So the opportunity to come together and sing is always an uplifting thing.
Yeah.
Which I think is why we've seen a resurgence in community choirs, because there's an acknowledgement that that's helpful and healing space for everybody. The Walking with Grief project, we've had two projects with that. That's been sponsored by the Department of Local Government, Sport and Culture. So the sense of that is to take people out into nature, because nature has its own healing capacity. I would just encourage any person in the community to walk with friends, no matter where you are, because it gives you opportunity to walk and talk. And when you walk and talk, you get a chance to get some of the stuff outside of your body, some of the emotions. So Walking with Grief project was about getting out in nature, having the intention of spending time reflecting, thinking about your loss, talking about it if you want to or not, but just having that intention of connecting with nature, because there's a bit of a healing that happens with that. We're about to do a project with Edmund Rice College at Northam. We're going to take some of the students out onto country who've experienced some significant losses. And we're also going to do another project up at Northam. We'll be taking some of the students up there onto the Kep Track and to Wallyunga Park to do some hikes, half-day hikes.
And you walk with them as facilitators to open the conversation if they want to.
And we might do, there might be some points along the journey where we'll give a reflection about something, about different animals and the way they do their life process. So, for example, when we talk about leaning into your grief, which is what we encourage people to do, to not run away from your grief, but to lean into it. We tell the story of the buffalo. So the buffalo, when a storm's approaching, all the other animals run away from the storm, but the buffalo runs into the storm. And so its experience of the storm is way shorter than the animals that have run away. And so we use that as sort of an analogy.
That is a really, really good analogy.
Analogy for grief.
I like that.
Yeah.
Like, you have that urge to cry, and if you're running away from it and bottling it up and holding on to it, it builds up and builds up and builds up. But if you just have a good cry, let it all out, face the storm, you feel better after and sooner.
You do. And I was just saying to Kath this morning, who's our team counselling lead, I was saying, asking the question around, should we be telling people to talk about people if they're no longer here? Is that the right thing? Because I'd had a client at one point who'd had a family member who were distressed whenever you said the name of the person that had passed. And Kath sort of said to me, well, that's what we want. We want them to release the emotion. And so if we're always afraid of saying the name, we're not giving them the opportunity to actually grieve. So my encouragement is speak about people.
And you're also remembering them in a positive way. So maybe you'll cry, but then you're kind of celebrating them and reminiscing.
Yes.
And that's an important part of the healing, isn't it?
It is. And so you've got to get beyond the deep, raw grief. And you don't get beyond that if you don't want to face it and you don't want to feel it.
No, so face the storm.
Yeah, got to feel it.
I think we'll end that there. I feel like we could talk for hours on this, but that's been really, really interesting, Hayley.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for the invitation. Really appreciate it.
Welcome.
Thanks.